Hello and welcome to Property Question Time. This is a show where you can have all of your property related questions answered by our team of experts. I'm Stephen Galpin, and joining me today are Joanna Leggett, co-founder of Leggett Immobilier, French property experts. Welcome to you, Joanna.
Thank you, Stephen.
And Byron Crellin, CEO of Debt Square Group. Welcome to you, Byron.
Hi, Stephen.
Okay, Joanna, you've been in France most of the year, I think, but you've made your way back here and escaped the quarantine now. How are things in France in the property market?
Well, surprisingly, considering we've had a pandemic for the last couple of years, it's absolutely booming. At the moment, obviously, we've had the difficulty with Brits being able to come over. So for us personally, we've been selling mainly to French, but the French market itself is really, really strong. We're seeing a lot of people moving to countryside properties rather than cities, or looking for more outside space. The interest rates in France are really low, at all-time low. So for first-time buyers or, young people trying to get a mortgage, you can get mortgage rates at 1.2%. So it's very, very low, and that's encouraging more people to buy. And we're seeing, in the past, particularly with rural or countryside properties, it might take 6 months to a year to sell. Now we're finding we might have 2 or 3 buyers on each property. So it's moving very, very quickly. Which is great.
I think as far as the UK is concerned, I think we've had quite a reasonable period over this last 12 months, which is quite surprising. But I think there was a small 2% drop in April. But whether the good market continues when they finish the incentives on stamp duty and that sort of thing, I don't know. We'll find out. Okay, well, let's move on with the questions. And Byron, I'm going to come to you first. So, I understand the laws on evicting squatters have changed in recent years. Can the experts explain how one can evict them and how long the process takes? What are their rights? That's a nice, easy one for you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think definition of what a squatter is. So, residential market in the UK, a squatter is not a squatter if it's a person that has just stopped paying their rent. You have to go through an eviction process. In terms of commercial property, a tenant that stops paying their rent and their lease comes to an end, they're still technically seen in the eyes of the law as a tenant, and it's classed as a tenancy at will. A squatter, by definition, is a commercial property that is void, and an individual or individuals that deliberately enter the property and then claims to have occupational rights. And at that process, then you have to go through a staged legal process. It's not very quick, I have to be honest, and certainly in the last 18 months we've had problems in getting writs through the court process. So typically a client will contact us and say, we've got a void property and we've had reports an individual or individuals are accessing the property. We would then, as stage one, attend the property as an enforcement agent to do a risk assessment, absolutely no engagement with the subjects, purely to identify whether the property has been breached and the condition of the property, and we try and get it. We can do a whole range of risk report on the property. At that point, you go back to the client, and if it's confirmed that there are individuals occupying that property, we then engage with a solicitor either directly through the instructing client, or through our own panel of solicitors that we engage with. They would make an application to the court. It would then be an accelerated possession and a writ of possession application to the High Court. We would then go and serve a notice at the property, and you actually serve the notice on the property again. You don't serve it on the individuals, and you've got professional squatters, and those professional squatters will have their signs on the property saying we have rights of occupation, etc., and they know the process.
And what's their ambition? To be bought out, I suppose?
No, not necessarily. These are, I have to be careful, these are professional individuals that will victimise void properties with no other gain but to create damage. I think recently we've had the situation at Euston with the underground tunnel. There is a percentage of individuals that specialise targeting void properties, and we're looking after several thousand properties at any one point for clients across the UK. And there is an insurance requirement to make sure that a property, when it's void, is secure. And we carry out void property inspections on a weekly basis for clients. And when it is breached, there isn't a case of asking them to leave. You have to go through that legal process. and then the writ is issued through the High Court.
And that has to be in the High Court rather than a county court,
Correct.
does it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So quite a complex process.
It's not straightforward, and I think the key thing that my message to any client would be, at that point where you've got to avoid property, insurance compliant, and make sure that you're engaging with, a void property specialist to ensure that there are weekly inspections or whatever the insurance requirements are to make sure that property is secure at any one time.
And in context of residential, how does it differ there?
So if you've got a tenant that is a recognised tenant, and the lease comes to an end, or they default, they're not deemed as squatters. They are just the tenant in occupation that's in default. If the property is void and an individual breaks in, we had a recent case where the lady of the property unfortunately passed away. The property went into probate, and a member of the family decided to move into the property and refused to leave. And we had to go through the process of court, which is problematic because of the courts are backlogged and the pandemic, etc.
I think there was something like 300,000 cases on backlog.
It's staggering. And actually, from a residential landlord in the UK, this has been a real tough place to be, because you've got tenants that just been caught up in the pandemic, redundancy, furlough, etc., that have defaulted, and there's now that relationship where you've got to go, are we going to be able to catch up, or do I need to find a new tenant? And if it is the case that you've got an individual that you want to evict, you have to then go through the court process. And again, as I say, it's not a quick process. And in the meantime, what does the property look like when that individual is evicted?
When it comes back, yeah.
Yeah.
Joanna, do you have much of this in France?
Very similar with the pandemic, obviously. And in France, there is a regulation or a law that you can't actually evict somebody between October and April. So if they get into that stage, they don't have to pay the rent or whatever, and you can't physically, even with a court order, ask them to leave until April. So that's a French law.
And what's the logic there? Is it just weather driven?
I presume so. It's like an old law that's never changed, but it literally, if tenants are hanging on and they get to October, they know that they can't be evicted until the following April.
Dangerous situation.
Well, that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because then you potentially in France, have you come across where there are professionals that will get into a property knowingly they're going to have this void period?
Well, I think some people do, but I mean, then they'll never be able to rent again because it's listed and stuff like that. So it doesn't. I mean, we don't do rentals. We obviously in sales, but it does happen. And if people are coming to the end of a tenancy, or they're leaving, or they're doing whatever, they can do that without paying, but they will get blacklisted, of course.
Yeah. So it seems like times are changing, doesn't it, Byron? We used to have the wicked landlord and the good tenant, and it's
the other way around.
It's getting a little bit mixed now, isn't it?
As I've said, for some people it's a professional career. We actually had a commercial property where we were told that somebody had trespassed. We turned up, and the individual was trading, selling jumpers, cashmere jumpers in London, and claimed that he'd got a licence. Couldn't produce a licence, but the law says we had to withdraw. We had to go through that process, and he left a message on the wall saying, "Thanks for having me. I made X, Y, Z."
Lovely.
Landlord was delighted.
Okay. All right, Joanna, your first question. Given that we've not really experienced a normal post-Brexit market in France due to COVID, do you think that it would be more difficult for those relocating to France in the future to take over their trusted UK contractors to carry out renovation works, etc.? Or should that now be the sole responsibility of French contractors only? I know we've had this similar sort of question before about the rights and wrongs of using local contractors or not, but it's actually quite a complex subject, isn't it?
Well, I would never recommend bringing people over from the UK because the insurances and everything are going to be totally different. If it's a holiday home and you're having work done to it and you're using UK contractors, when you come to pay capital gains tax, you won't be able to claim any of that back because they're not French registered builders. If you're worried about the language barrier, there's loads of British registered companies in France that can be highly recommended, and you can have a look at the work that they've done. But also things like electrics, for example, you have to have them signed off by EDF, and unless you've got a French certificate to be an electrician, EDF won't sign that off. So, it's going to be very difficult. And some of the things, even like tubing and stuff for plumbing, is very different in France to what it is in the UK. So the other thing is as well with integration, if you're moving to France permanently, you should use local builders, whether they're English, French or whatever, because it'll help you to integrate into the community.
Sure.
If something goes wrong, they're there, they can come back and, you know, repair whatever goes wrong. You need assurances, for example, if it's a roof, you're going to need a 10-year guarantee. Bringing someone from the UK is not going to be able to provide that in France because they're not registered for VAT in France, and you'll need VAT receipts, particularly if you're going to be paying any capital gains tax. So personally, and if I was recommended to a client, you know, if it's someone's coming over to do painting and decorating, then of course, because people can do that themselves. But any major constructions, I would always use a local tradesman that is registered and legal in France.
Well, the warranty situation is particularly important when you come to selling on. I mean, it's like all property, isn't it? It's very easy to get into. It's not always that easy to get out of.
No.
And you can find that sort of blockage if there's no guarantee.
And also, you know, there's a lot of builders in France that'll be working on the black, so they're not paying tax or they're doing it for cash. And again, I wouldn't suggest that because you're not covered. And insurance-wise, you're not covered. If anything does go wrong or a wall collapses or the building falls down, if you haven't used registered artisans, you won't be covered by insurance. So I would always say to try and go local, get some recommendations, get 3 quotes. I've personally been in France for 15 years, and the builders that I've always used on any of the properties that we've had have been amazing. And can come highly recommended, and everybody will be able to recommend good builders.
I think the moral is here, isn't it, that you know, if you're going to move to France, don't try and take England with you. Really,
No,
be committed.
No. Yeah.
Be committed and integrate.
Yeah.
I mean, you get the best out of your situation.
Exactly. I think the language barrier is what people worry about the most, because if they're moving and they don't speak any French, they're thinking we'll have to bring British builders over. But there are hundreds of Brits working in France, fully registered, legally, you know, all the legal requirements, all the certificates to do whatever trade they're in, whether it's electricians or plumbing. So you'll be able to find British builders as well. And some of the British companies actually might have a French stonemason and a French electrician, but you can deal with someone in English if you don't speak French.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that's good advice. Thank you. Anything to add to that, Byron?
Pack my bags.
You and me both, I think. Let's go for the sunshine.
I'll see you there.
Yes, all right. Well, listen, we're going to go to a break now, so join me again after the break with Joanna and Byron. Hello, welcome back to Property Question Time Part 2. I'm Stephen Galpin, and joining me are Joanna Leggett and Byron Crellin. Welcome back, guys. Byron, your second question. Does the new debt respite scheme apply to rent and service charge arrears? If so, how does the system work? In addition, is this new assistance for individuals, or does it cover small companies too? Now, that's again quite a complex question, covering a broad spectrum.
You're on form today.
Yeah.
So this legislation came in 4th of May, and it's purely for individuals. So the first part of the question, yes, it does capture rent and service charge. So if your tenant is an individual sole trader, then the debt respite, it's basically a breathing space. So
perhaps you could just explain broadly what it's.
Yeah. So the mechanics and the rules of it is that an individual can apply for a 60-day cooling period, of which at 30 days their position would be reviewed. The individual can't just elect to go into the breathing space period. That will be controlled by either a local authority or a organisation regulated by the FCA. And ground rules are you can only enter into this once a year. So this isn't a serial thing. You can sort of piggyback and go for another 30 days or 60 days. You can't be bankrupt. There is no qualifying amount. That's the key thing. So if an individual has arrears, then this isn't a write-off opportunity. This is purely a point in time where you've got 60 days for what they give it, a breathing space. But at that point, you should be taking advice and engaging with the parties that you have monies outstanding to come to an arrangement. It's not.
So it's debt management rather than mitigation, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And as I say, there's no qualifying amount, and the government introduced this. And this, if you download the legislation paper, it reads very much that it's for an individual that may have lost their job, etc., and therefore may have store cards, etc., and have a series of debts that will need some time to work through and get into a debt management payment plan, etc. But it does capture commercial tenants that are individuals.
Okay. And is it working?
No.
I knew that'd be a good question.
The pandemic has put landlords, commercial landlords, in a situation where tenants are protected. So the debt respite opportunity hasn't been, that we've seen across our portfolio of clients, been undertaken by tenants. That might really partly be because people don't know it exists. I mean, it only came in on the 4th of May, but also by the fact that the legislation that is in place at this moment in time ring fences arrears and protects commercial tenants, whether they are corporates or whether they are individuals. That protection, that ring fence at this moment in time, the more that the government have put in place and now extended out until 2022, is sufficient, and landlords and tenants are having to negotiate across the table without any kind of enforcement or litigation remedy.
And are you finding that tenants and landlords are negotiating, are talking? I mean, in the past we've had situations where we've had credit crunches and things like that have caused difficulties, and there's almost been a standoff between landlords and tenants, hasn't there? But nowadays I don't know whether it's different.
It's there are serial offenders, big organisations that are not paying rent, and you've got smaller businesses, middle-sized businesses that have come to payment plan arrangements. There is over £6 billion worth of rent arrears in the UK.
Wow.
And growing.
And where's this all going to end up?
Well, the government have extended the legislation again till March quarter day, 25th of March 2022. They have said for businesses that have been affected, so cinemas, ice rinks, those kind of businesses that have not been able to open during the course of the pandemic, the arrears that they may have will be ring fenced. And what the legislation came out, the government have announced recently, very recently, in the last couple of weeks, is that those arrears will be non-enforceable, and they're going to introduce further legislation that, and I quote their phrase, ring fence those arrears. So a landlord will not be able to pursue those arrears. In terms of everybody else outside of that category, the only thing that a landlord and tenant can do is talk, and it's got to be by the appetite of both parties. Now, a landlord is at the table for the first time, probably before the tenant is going, "What are you doing?" It's extremely painful for commercial landlords.
But I suppose some of the bigger institutional landlords are going to be able to write these arrears off against tax, aren't they? So it probably might not be quite as damaging as.
I think that might be a forced financial position that they can default to, but I think, representing our database of clients, that's the last thing that they want. What they want is a fair playing ground for being able to have some kind of remedy to recover their arrears.
Yeah. Joanna, is there much of this going on in France at the moment? Is there much support for commercial entities?
To be honest, we obviously don't cover rentals, so I couldn't really answer that. I would imagine that it's going to be the same the world over with what's happening with the pandemic. I've seen so many businesses closed and so many properties, rental, particularly in Paris. When you drive through Paris, there's so many things that have closed down, so whether they're supposed to be paying rent or not paying rent, but yeah, it has affected everybody.
I think, Byron, you're right. I think there are a number of tenants who are, shall we say, playing around with this situation. But I do worry. I walk around London and I see on Oxford Street a lot of empty shops.
Yeah.
Even in Canary Wharf here, we've got empty shops, which I haven't had for ages. So I don't know quite where we end up with all this, but there we are. Strange times.
Indeed.
Joanna, your second question. Looking at what's for sale across France, it seems that one can still buy the most amazing chateau-type properties at comparably lower prices compared to similar UK property. I naturally understand that there are inherent risks in making such a purchase in terms of ongoing maintenance costs, etc. But are there any other costs I should be aware of, like any particular surcharges or extra duties when purchasing towards the top end of the market, some of these spectacular properties?
There's no extra costs involved from buying a €40,000 barn to a chateau. It benefits you to pay more because the fees are less. So if you're paying
proportionally,
usually fees on a chateau type property will be between 4 and 6% for agency fees, whereas on smaller properties they can range from like 7 to 10%. So you do get slightly less fees because you're buying more. Obviously in France you can buy a chateau, you know, a 12-bedroom chateau with lakes and everything else for €500,000, which would be the price of a one-bedroom flat. Just get your checkbooks out and sort you out something. So it is, you can, but again, you know, the renovation and the upkeep of these type of properties, bearing in mind they were built hundreds of years ago, most of them, there's no insulation. You've got to look at the roof costs if the roof, you know, needs doing. We had a property on the market recently which was on for 800,000. It was a huge castle with a moat and everything, but the roof needed doing, and that was 2 million. So, you know, you've got to bear in mind these costs and make sure if you are buying something very large and you're not used to renovation work or building work, that you do get some quotes in before going ahead and putting an offer in.
I mean, Byron's comment was, "Whoop, let's go," when we talked about this subject earlier. But how careful do you have to be? Are the properties listed the same way some of our properties are listed?
Well, the French tend not to. The Bâtiment de France is very similar to the sort of national trust that we would have in the UK. And a lot of the buildings aren't protected by that because the French don't want the rules and regulations that go alongside that. So there are a lot, and it depends where you're located. If you're actually in a village, there are a lot of laws, like, for example, you can't put a swimming pool in if you're next to a church. So those sort of things you might want to be aware of.
I don't quite get the connection.
But the funny thing is, you're allowed an overground pool, which is quite ugly in comparison to an in-ground pool, but you're not allowed if you're next to a church. Something to do with aerial views and things like that, which is just a regulation. And also in the colour that you paint the shutters and things, some of the towns are protected, and you have to have similar, you've got a sort of a bible of what colours you're allowed to paint your shutters, and you have to stick to those colours, and some is all the same because it's a protected village and things like that. So there's sort of rules and regulations like that, probably not as strict as they are in the UK. It's not quite as strict. And again, if you want to do internal work to the property, they don't tend to have the building regulations that we have here. So you could knock out a wall or go into the loft without planning permission. But any new windows, openings, doors or reconstruction, you do need planning permission for.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think buying any expensive and sort of rambling property, if you like, is going to be inherently dangerous one way or another. Now, just because I know that both you and Trevor, as directors of Leggett Immobilier, are very knowledgeable, and you impart that knowledge very well in your publicity and your brochures and things. Would that, in your experience, apply across the board in France? If I was to go and want to buy a chateau or something, would I find the local agent particularly helpful in that respect, in just pointing out some of the sensitive points, really? As you say, somebody could get caught out with having to pay for a £2 million roof. Would it be pretty traumatic, wouldn't it, once you'd signed on the dotted line?
I mean, in France, they don't tend to do surveys, so you don't need a survey for a mortgage in France, for example. However, if I was purchasing a large property, or particularly on that sort of scale like a chateau, I would definitely have a survey done. You can't make offers subject to survey in France, so you'd have to have the survey done and then put the offer in. So you can't do it like we do in the UK, subject to survey, because the French don't do it. They do their diagnostic tests, and that's enough, which is the 5 tests for lead, asbestos, electrics, the septic tank, etc. And that's all they do. So if you were worried about a property or it looks like it's going to need quite a bit of work, I would definitely have a survey done first.
Okay, thank you. Well, Byron, we don't have time to come back to you on that, but I don't suppose you've got a lot to add to £2 million roofs, have you? Right, okay. All right. Well, look, let's say a big thank you to both Joanna Leggett from Leggett Immobilier and Byron Crellin from Debt Squared Group. Thank you both very much for coming in today. Great programme, great information you've imparted. Join me again next time on Property Question Time.